The following podcast contains discussions of sex, violence, suicide, and two teenagers who are just too immature to live. Also, spoilers. Lots of spoilers. Ready? Let's dig in. Have you ever felt like fate was leading you somewhere or to someone? Standing in the street in front of his enemy's palace, Romeo has a deep feeling in his gut that something bad is about to happen. His palms sweat, his heart races, he hears the muted strains of music and laughter coming from inside, where guests have gathered in fancy costumes and masks. He puts on his own mask. A burst of adrenaline rushes through his body. He knows that if someone recognizes him, if someone catches him, he might be killed. But he also knows that his fate is waiting inside for him and he wants to dance. Inside, with the girl that he loves. A girl named Rosaline. Wait, Rosaline? Who is she? Well, you know the story is not called Romeo and Rosaline, but we'll get to that in a bit. Hi, I'm Gabby, and this is Digestibles, a podcast about all the books you were told to read, but probably didn't. And today, we're breaking down literature's most famous pair of lovers, Romeo and Juliet. Now, you've probably already heard about these two crazy kids somewhere. They've become the archetype or icons for young, passionate, uncontrollable love. Romeo is practically a synonym for the word lover. A lot has been written of, inspired by, and referenced with them. There's been music, there's been memes, there's even been a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. And if you're thinking who, then OMG, when did I get old? But what makes this story so compelling that so many other works of art have been patterned on it? Let's find out.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured pietous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife.
Yes, if by some reason you don't know how this ends, well, don't worry, because Shakespeare will tell you right at the start with a chorus of spoilers. Think of them like a gaggle of gossipy neighbors just waiting to tell you all the deets you didn't ask for and didn't really want to know. Anyway, here's the scoop. There are two families in this town who absolutely hate each other. Nobody really explains why, you just have to go with it. Both families have children who fall in love, then die by suicide. And that their deaths finally end the quarrel. Finally, Shakespeare throws in a little warning that this whole thing is going to take around 2 hours, so you can go out and pee or buy snacks first. Shakespeare is also a lying liar who lies, as the play usually takes more than 2 hours, even with lines cut. I've watched enough of them to know this. But I'm not going to take 2 hours of your life. If you do want popcorn, go ahead and grab some now, because there's going to be plenty of drama. We are in Verona in northern Italy, a sunlit city of brick and stone right at the foot of the mountains beside a river. Verona is known as the Painted City, where rich families would paint the walls of their palaces with murals and bright colors. Some of these facades remain to this very day. Anyway, the Montagues and Capulets are two such families. They exist rather vaguely in history, appearing first in the 13th century, as the more Italian-sounding Montecchi and Cappelletti. The story was probably passed around like an urban legend until an Italian monk and writer, Matteo Bandello, published a collection of such tales between 1554 and 1573. The stories became popular in Europe and were translated into French and English. Fast forward 20 years later, and Shakespeare, arguably the greatest fanfic writer of all time, uses these stories as the source for 3 of his most popular plays: Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, and of course, Romeo and Juliet. In the hot and crowded streets of Verona, a Capulet servant bites his fingers at a Montague servant. This is apparently the 16th century version of giving someone the finger. The Montagues are not amused, and soon swords are clashing and fists are flying, and they are shouting, "Down with the Capulets!" or "Down with the Montagues!" These servants definitely deserve a raise for all of their loyalty. The violence gets worse and worse until the Prince of Verona arrives to break things up. He's really, really tired of their bullshit. He proclaims that the next time somebody decides to brawl in his city, it'll be death for everyone involved. Enter Romeo Montague, our hero. He's young, passionate, and honestly, kind of emo. So emo that his parents are worried about him. He's sick with love and won't shut up about it. Unfortunately, the girl he loves does not return his feelings. Romeo's friend Benvolio tells him, "Just get over it already." But Romeo ignores him. He's got a head full of dreams, but not a shred of common sense between his ears. Over at the Capulet household, Verona's not-so-favorite bachelor, Paris, wants to marry Lord Capulet's daughter. At first, Lord Capulet is confused because, she's only 13. But alright, he'll introduce them at his party tonight, and hey, maybe Juliet will fall in love with him. Because that's how it works, right? The subject of this conversation, Juliet, is in her room getting ready for the party when her mother comes in to tell her excitedly about the marriage proposal from Paris. Juliet is so not here for it, but since she's a good daughter, she says she'll give him a chance. Not so far away, Romeo and Benvolio are still arguing when a Capulet servant interrupts to ask them for help to read something. It turns out to be a guest list for the party that night. Real helpful of them. Romeo sees the name of his love, who just so happens to be the Capulet's niece, Rosaline. He decides he's going to crash the festivities. While sneaking into the party, they bump into Mercutio, their flashy friend. Witty and unpredictable, his solution to Romeo's heartache is to put it mildly, the best way to get over a girl is to get under a new one. Romeo doesn't want a new girl, he wants Rosaline. Mercutio calls him an idiot. And what do you know? He's right, because 5 seconds later, Romeo sees Juliet dancing and forgets all about his Rosaline. It's love at first sight.
Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night, like a rich jewel in an Aethiope's ear. Beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. So shows a snowy dove trooping with crows, as yonder lady o'er her fellows shows. The measure done, I'll watch her place of stand, and, touching hers, make blessed my rude hand. Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night.
Juliet is bored. She's danced with Paris, who's an okay guy, just somewhat lacking in the personality department. She wants more to life than marriage to an okay guy. The party whirls around her, the same faces, the same crowd. Their noise bursts and swells too loud to bear when suddenly the world goes silent. Romeo approaches her and takes her hand. It's love at first sight. Romeo is a poet and smooth with the pickup lines. He asks if their lips could touch like their hands, and before long, they're making out. The nurse looks for Juliet and separates them. Romeo asks for the lady's name, and she tells him Juliet is the daughter of the house. His heart sinks. She's a Capulet. Juliet asks the nurse to run and ask for the boy's name, and when the nurse returns, her heart sinks. The boy she loves is a Montague. Cue dramatic music. No, really, cue dramatic music.
but soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou her maid art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green, and none but fools do wear it. Cast it off. It is my lady. Oh, it is my love. Oh, that she knew she were. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? Her eye discourses. I will answer it. I am too bold. 'Tis not to me she speaks. Two of the fair stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars. As daylight doth a lamp, her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek.
Romeo ditches his friends to hide in the Capulet's garden. He spies Juliet in her balcony and listens as she sighs about how she'll love him even without his name because he's just perfection. Soon he can't resist and calls out to her. And we get one of the most romantic love scenes ever written. I'll spare your ears because we can only take so much poetry and vows and declarations about how their love is deep and infinite. Finally, Juliet is all, "Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, but if you like me, maybe you should put a ring on it." And contrary to lifetimes of social conditioning where we expect men to be afraid of commitment, Romeo goes, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Juliet's nurse calls her. They make plans to meet again tomorrow. Juliet goes to bed, and Romeo leaves to find a priest. He finds Friar Lawrence, who, foreshadowing alert, is looking for plants and herbs to make his poisons. Medicine. Friar Lawrence takes one look at Romeo and asks if he's finally hooked up with Rosaline. And our boy Romeo is like, "Rosaline who? I'm marrying Juliet." And Friar Lawrence is like, But 5 minutes ago you were in love with Rosaline." Romeo refuses to acknowledge this reality check and asks the priest to perform the marriage tomorrow. Friar Lawrence agrees because he thinks this will make everyone be friends again. Sweet summer child. Meanwhile, Juliet's cousin, Tybalt, is looking for Romeo. He had seen him in the Capulet's party and has promised him violence. A lot of violence. Romeo's BFFs just laugh about it like a deadly feud hasn't existed for centuries. They much prefer to do what boys do when they get together and tell a lot of dirty jokes. Romeo tells Juliet's nurse that the wedding is all arranged and that Juliet should meet him at Friar Lawrence's chapel. At the chapel, Friar Lawrence tries again to tell Romeo to calm his ass down. Romeo once more ignores his advice. Juliet arrives and the two horny teenagers are just too horny that the good friar has no choice but to marry them so they can at least be horny under the sanctity of marriage. Tybalt is going around Verona trying to sniff out Romeo like a bloodhound. But he finds Benvolio and Mercutio instead. Tybalt provokes Mercutio by implying that he and Romeo are more than just BFFs, if you know what he means. Bromance, am I right? Benvolio just wants everyone to be friends again, but Mercutio is ready for a fight. Romeo returns. Tybalt wants to duel with Romeo, but Romeo is now secretly married to Juliet and he doesn't want to engage with her cousin because they were now cousins too, technically. Shocked, Mercutio draws his sword and challenges Tybalt instead, and everything is fun and games until Tybalt stabs Mercutio. Mercutio dies, cursing a plague on both your houses. And Romeo, true to his character flaw, just acts before he thinks. He raises his sword against Tybalt, steel versus steel, and in his rage, Romeo kills him. Benvolio tells him to run. The prince arrives and decides to banish Romeo. Juliet Juliet is really excited for her wedding night. This is surprising for a girl who only a couple of days ago did not want to be married at all. The nurse comes in to tell her the bad news. Juliet is upset but forgives Romeo and wants the nurse to go and find him because she doesn't want to die a virgin. Teenagers. Romeo is hiding with Friar Lawrence. He wants to kill himself. Of course, because that's his answer to everything. But he is interrupted. The nurse comes to fetch Romeo. Friar Lawrence encourages him to visit Juliet and consummate the marriage to make it legal. Basically, he has to hit it before he quits it. Then he can go to Mantua and wait until it's safe to come back. Romeo and Juliet spend the night together. The next morning, Romeo leaves her.
Wilt thou be gone? It is not yet near day. It was the nightingale, and not the lark, that pierced the fearful hollow of thine ear. Nightly she sings on yon pomegranate tree. Believe me, love, it was the nightingale.
It was the lark, the herald of the morn. No nightingale, look, love, what envious streaks! Dew lace the severing clouds in yonder east. Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. I must be gone and live, or stay and die.
Juliet is depressed. Her parents think it's because Tybalt is dead, but we know it's because of Romeo. Lord Capulet decides that to cheer her up, she'll get married to Paris. This is the opposite of what she wanted. She refuses, and Lord Capulet threatens to throw her out if she doesn't agree. She begs her mother to help, but Lady Capulet just storms out. She asks her nurse for help, and the nurse says, at least Paris isn't a murderer. Juliet runs to Friar Lawrence next. Like Romeo, she threatens to kill herself. The friar isn't a big fan of bigamy, so he agrees to help her. He offers a sleeping potion that'll make her look dead for 42 hours. She'll be put in a tomb in their family's vault, where she can wait for Romeo. He promises to write to Romeo. Juliet goes home and pretends to be okay with the marriage. Lord Capulet says, okay then, let's get you married tomorrow. She then spends the night alone and resolves to drink the potion even though she's scared it'll kill her. Because drinking potions handed to you by strange men is always a good idea.
Farewell. God knows when we shall meet again. I have a faint cold fear thrills through my veins that almost freezes up the heat of life. I'll call them back again to comfort me. Nurse, what should she do here? My dismal scene, I needs must act alone. Come, Phial, what if this mixture do not work at all? Shall I be married then? Tomorrow morning? No, no, this shall forbid it. Lie thou there.
The next day, everyone is getting ready for a wedding. Nobody is prepared for a funeral. The nurse discovers Juliet's body. She's taken to the tomb, right as planned. Murphy's Law probably wasn't a very popular saying in the 16th century, or else Friar Lawrence would have been prepped for anything and everything to go wrong. His letter never reaches Romeo in Mantua. Instead, a servant finds him and tells him of Juliet's death. Distressed, the only solution that Romeo can think of is, you guessed it, death. He buys poison from some random apothecary or a pharmacist and returns to Verona. Friar Lawrence finds out that Romeo never received his letter. He rushes to the tomb to tell Juliet. Paris, who is always where he is never wanted, is in the cemetery grieving when Romeo arrives. He tries to arrest Romeo and they fight and... oops, Romeo just can't stop killing people. Romeo finds Juliet's body. He wonders why she doesn't look dead. And here are the things Romeo could have done before attempting to kill himself. Check in with his boo Friar Lawrence. Look more closely at Juliet's corpse. Recite a longer monologue. Or just wait one more damn minute. But this is a tragedy of epic proportions, so no, he does none of that. Instead, he kisses her one last time and drinks the potion. Because this isn't a fairy tale, the princess stays asleep and the prince dies. The friar arrives and finds Romeo dead. Juliet finally wakes up and sees Romeo's body. Friar Lawrence tries to get her to run away, but Juliet won't leave. She kisses Romeo, hoping that there's some poison left on his lips. There's none. A noise startles her, so she grabs the next best thing, his dagger, and stabs herself. She falls on Romeo's body and dies. Everybody and their uncle arrives at the tomb. The Montagues, the Capulets, the prince, and probably the chorus too. Even though Shakespeare's kind of forgotten all about them. The friar explains everything to a crowd of shocked Pikachu faces. The prince is like, "You see what your silly war has done? Can we all agree to be adults now?" Grieving, the Montagues and the Capulets finally end their feud. Romeo and Juliet are buried together as two clingy drama queens should be. And thus ends the most excellent and lamentable tragedy of Romeo and Juliet.
A glooming peace this morning with it brings. The sun for sorrow will not show its head. Go hence to have more talk of these sad things. Some shall be pardoned and some punished. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo.
Before I continue, I'd like to remind everyone that suicide is a complex and serious problem that quietly affects a lot of Filipinos today. If you're not okay, please remember that you are not alone and don't be afraid to ask for help. The National Center for Mental Health is a 24/7 crisis hotline you can call at 0917-899-8727. So was it fate that made things fatal? Were Romeo and Juliet's stars truly star-crossed and were they destined for heartbreak? Let's look to the actual stars for answers. Like today, astrology was very popular in the 16th century, so it's not hard to imagine that Shakespeare himself was also inspired by the practice. There's so much imagery within the play about the sun, moon, and stars, and so much talk about fate and how it affects the characters' lives. We don't have their birth charts, of course. They're fictional, but let's try to figure it out anyway. Juliet is a Leo. We know this because her birth date is specifically mentioned as Lammas Eve. Lammas, a harvest festival, is celebrated on August 1, which makes Juliet's birthday July 31. Leo is a sun sign and a fire sign. It makes sense because Juliet is often described as bright and is compared to the sun a lot. Even though she's frightfully young, she quietly determined, knows exactly what she wants, and goes after it. After all, she's the one who proposes to Romeo. How very modern of her, and how very consistent with the Leo personality. Romeo's zodiac is harder to pin down. Shakespeare never mentions his birth date or his age, but it's assumed that he's only a little bit older than Juliet. He's impulsive, intense, and highly romantic. Maybe he just has too many feelings, guys. Or maybe he's a Cancer. If Juliet is the sun, then Romeo is the moon. Juliet is fire, Romeo is water. Are these opposites compatible? The stars say maybe, if they work at it. Their contrasts can complement each other, but it will be hard to maintain in the long term, and they'll have to truly commit to each other to have a relationship that lasts. And hey, at least he's not a Taurus or Scorpio, because that would have made them really incompatible. So if the plan had worked, would Romeo and Juliet have made it? You decide. But let's face it, a relationship based on 2 days of infatuation, generations of trauma, and so many careless emotions, they totally would have broken up. Thanks for listening, you guys. I hope I made Romeo and Juliet a little bit easier to digest. Once again, I'm Gabby, and you can find me at Gabby Pascua Vox on Instagram. That's GABYPASCUAVOX. Or use the hashtag Digestibles Podcast. Digestibles is part of Connect, a podcast network, bringing together entertaining stories to spark your imagination. For more awesome content, follow us on social media at Connect Podcasts.